blink and you will miss it, because the diplomatic rollercoaster is working at light speed. Fresh off the release of a Russian-backed peace plan, we now have a Europe-authored counterproposal. Wait, this is getting out of hand. Now there are two counterproposals. The trouble is that one does not simply write a good peace deal, and something indeed has been lost in Europe deferring to Russia to take the first step in releasing a wide-ranging peace proposal. So, today, I want to do three things. First, I want to set the scene to explain why taking charge of diplomacy and getting offers into the public is critical for obtaining a good negotiated outcome. And I know that this was the focus of yesterday's video, but today we are going to reinforce it with some lines on maps. Second, I will provide a broad overview of what is happening with the European proposal, and why Europe has ceded some of the power described in the previous point. Finally, I will give my unscripted comments for each of the 27 points that Europe has released. But let's start with the importance of agenda-setting power in diplomacy. I have seen conversations that none of the diplomatic jockeying matters at all. Worse, I have seen some cite one of the central lessons of crisis bargaining theory as justification for that. Namely, that any negotiated settlement must be commensurate with the balance of power. Thus, really what the Western coalition should be focusing on is mobilizing as much military might to Ukraine as possible. And, well, yes, it is true that more bombs are better than fewer bombs. Likewise, if wars would only end in the complete military defeat of one side, then yes, I would advise focusing on the weapons part exclusively. The problem is that the vast majority of wars end in some form of negotiated settlement. Consistent with that, I have said for years now that military defeat was a very unlikely outcome for this war in particular. And now that we are in this war's perhaps most intense phase of negotiation so far, it seems that the importance of setting the political agenda is proving true. With that in mind, here is the thing. There is a range of settlements that are better for both parties than fighting a war. I am sure that you know that, because I have repeated that line about 100 times to you already. Those agreements all surround the expected outcome of the war, and they radiate outward to reflect Ukraine's costs of the war to the left and Russia's costs of the war to the right. You can see that there are substantial differences in the quality of an outcome drawn close to Ukraine's indifference point, and an outcome drawn close to Russia's indifference point. So, in addition to wanting to militarily control the situation by altering where the bargaining range lies, you also want to politically control where within the bargaining range you settle. I do not want to turn this into a Game Theory 101 class, but I literally teach undergraduates every year that one of the most important determinants of where a negotiated settlement ends up is who actually makes the proposals. So, if no one is stopping you, make the proposals. This is why we had a very long video only yesterday about how bad it is that Europe and the Trump administration effectively deferred agenda-setting power to Russia. We can observe this directly. Russia's plan has dominated the Western conversation on the subject. Think about that for a second. The Kremlin is supposed to be the master of the art of controlling the Russian media, but its tentacles are extending much further than that. To see where exactly we are going here, look no further than evidence from the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. We could go through story after story, seeing that hundreds of outlets are reporting on the subject, across the political spectrum, which is exactly your goal when you are trying to set the agenda. And if we could move away from that information overload for a second, what I really like about Ground News are a couple of features that help me stay informed, particularly in times when I am getting swamped. One is my personalized feed, so I can double-check that I have caught everything on the topics that I care about. The other is the blind spot. And look right there. Drone sightings disrupt traffic at Eindhoven Airport. Yep, that is still happening. Easy to miss, but not with ground news. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan, which gives you access to all of these features and more. So thanks again to Ground News for their continued support. And that takes us to part 2 of today's video. The broad contents of Europe's counterproposal show just how Europe lost the initiative here. Now, there are actually 2 counterproposals that leaked to the media. One was this 24-point plan first reported by The Telegraph. The other was a 27.5-point plan first reported by Reuters. The second one seems to be the plan that everyone has consolidated around, so I am going to spend the majority of the time today discussing it. You can immediately see that Europe is playing defense here, not offense. It is a 27.5-point plan, because the document basically takes the 28-point Russian plan and edits each one of them to better suit what Europe wants, while removing 1 point entirely. In other words, Europe has allowed Russia to dictate where the focus of the peace deal is. These are Moscow's priorities, revised to meet Europe's objections. To further the trouble, one of the things that drawing lines on maps belies is that bargaining takes place on multiple dimensions. So not only is there a multiplicity of possible peaceful outcomes, there is a multiplicity of multiplicities. And Europe is fighting on the political domains that Russia prefers. You can also tell that Europe was hastily reacting to the proposal, rather than providing its own coherent narrative. It reads disjointed in places, and contains some imprecise phrasing. There is also inconsistent punctuation in the document, though perhaps that was Reuters doing a poor copy-paste job. And look, I do not think that we should be too worried about whether sentences end in a period or not when we are talking about the military domain. But it does show a lack of attention to the construction of the document, and that should be concerning. I should also note that the alternative 24-point plan is not much better. True, its format does not use the Russian proposal as a template, but I want to draw your attention to point 20. Ukraine enjoys unhindered passages on the Dnipro River and the Kinburn Split. The Kinburn Split is this weird piece of land that juts out into the Black Sea. Technically, it is a part of the Mykolaiv Oblast, even though it is attached to the Kherson Oblast, and the rest of Mykolaiv is across the Gulf. Given that, you can see how Europe would want to press the Kinburn Split back into Ukrainian control. Russia was only supposed to have annexed Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson during the ceremony. The Kinburn Split is a part of Mykolaiv, so perhaps it should be treated differently. However, Russia claims the Kinburn Split is a part of Kherson, and so the point is moot. But the point for us now is that the Kinburn Split does not exist. It is the Kinburn Spit. A spit is a weird word for this type of landform. But if you had the geographic knowledge of the area, you would have immediately seen the error. The point is that Europe is hastily reacting to what the Trump administration is doing, and that is taking its toll on the whole situation. Anyway, let's get to the third part of today's video, a point-by-point breakdown of Europe's proposal. For each of these points, I will place Russia's original proposal on the right, allowing us to see the changes that Europe's new proposal makes. Then I will provide my own semi-structured commentary on each. There are 28 points, of course, so if you only have time to listen to a few, then I would suggest jumping to number 8 on NATO troop rules, number 21 on territorial exchanges, and number 25 on elections. You know what? Add number 10 to the list, which is on Article 5 style security guarantees. That one is a banger. Oh, and like how I did this for the original Russian plan, there's not going to be much visually interesting happening here. So if you would like to, I would again recommend doing the dishes, going for a walk, taking your dog to the park, or that sort of thing, because you're going to be mostly listening to me from here on in. Point 1. Ukraine's sovereignty to be reconfirmed. You will note that the only difference between the new version and the old version is substituting confirmed with reconfirmed. And you can think about why Europe wanted to do that. If Russia signs this, then the Kremlin is implicitly declaring that Ukraine was a sovereign entity all along, and that works against a lot of the Kremlin propaganda that is mostly geared in-house inside of Russia, with the idea that Ukraine is not a real political entity, and all Russia is doing in the special military operation is retaking land that was, quote-unquote, rightfully Russian all along. The small change reflects something that we will see recur through a lot of the other 27 points. There are some significant changes to the actual substance of what's going on in the ground. Don't get me wrong, and we will cover those. But a lot of what Europe is doing in the new document is changing some of the political language. As I said just a second ago, Russia uses some political phrases in ways that are inconsistent with how Europe wants to think about things. Russia is primarily doing that for its domestic audience, but it also filters more broadly. And so what Europe is trying to crack down on in a lot of this document is some of that Russian-oriented language. And I suspect there are probably subtleties in here that I am going to miss, because, again, they are subtle, and actually catching them is not the easiest thing to do. Point 2. There will be a total and complete non-aggression agreement reached between Russia and Ukraine and NATO. All ambiguities from the last 30 years will be resolved. 2 points worth noting, though, one humorous and one subtle but serious. The humorous point is that both of these documents say that they are going to do something to the ambiguities, resolved or settled. We'll talk about that in a second. But it is ambiguous what the ambiguities are. They are not written down, so it's unclear what exactly is going to be taken care of after this document is signed. The subtle but significant difference is the use of the word resolved versus settled. And I know that on the surface, those two words look synonymous. And indeed, whoever wrote the European version of this document may have thought that they actually were synonyms and was not intending to do anything with this. But we need to go deeper into the difference between resolved and settled. I had to double check this because I wasn't 100% sure, but indeed, if you look at the NATO Membership Action Plan, that's effectively the guidebook that NATO gives to potential new members, a checklist, if you will, that the new members or potential new members have to complete before they can actually become a full member of NATO. It says in there that aspirants would be expected to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. Emphasis there on the word settle. It does not say in the NATO Membership Action Plan to resolve them, it says to settle them. And so I wonder if someone felt the need to change that word. Is someone in Europe concerned that Ukraine is going to point to this document and say, Russia signed it, we signed it, you signed it. There is consensus among all of the groups that this conflict has been settled, and what our requirement is for joining NATO, among other things, is to have a conflict settled. And that person in Europe who's concerned about this is going to point to this document and say, no, it's not settled, it's just resolved. And perhaps resolved in this way of thinking about things is saying that you have not actually figured out a complete solution. There is still an underlying conflict. It's just that you have figured out a way to have a peaceful resolution to this for now, rather than settling the principles that underlie the issues at stake. Again, I could be overreading this. I do not know if the writer of the second document, for example, just prefers the word resolved to settled. That's a possibility. But if this was intentional, because they were worried about the use of the word settled instead of resolved, it is interesting that it is Europe that is trying to make sure that Ukraine does not have a case for NATO membership as a consequence of this part. Point 3 does not exist. That's why I said that this has 27.5 points, because they deleted one of them, this third one, which previously said, it is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries, and NATO will not expand further. Interestingly, Reuters reports that it had seen an earlier document that did have a third point that was then subsequently deleted. And back then it said, 3. There will be the expectation that Russia will not invade its neighbors, and NATO will not expand further. When we looked at the Russian document, I had previously commented on how NATO does not use the word expand, it uses the word enlarge. So it's curious that at least in the deleted version of this point, which probably we shouldn't be overinterpreting because it was deleted, it still used the word expand and not enlarge. Oh, and another thing that we will see recur is a change from American English to British English when it comes to spelling. Point 4. After a peace agreement is signed, a dialogue between Russia and NATO will convene to address all security concerns and create a de-escalatory environment to ensure global security and increase opportunity for connectivity and future economic opportunity. Yep, you heard me. We're going to increase the opportunity for future economic opportunity. Hooray! The only big difference between the two is that previously the dialogue between Russia and NATO was going to be mediated by the United States. If it is indeed true that the previous document was written by Russia, you can understand why Russia would have wanted to insert that mediated by the United States clause. It makes it seem like the United States is not a part of NATO. It increases the wedge between European countries and the United States, and that is something that Russia is a really big fan of. Europe, of course, is not a fan of that, so there is no mediation from the United States here because the United States is a part of NATO, and so it's just going to be a conversation between Russia and NATO. Point 5. Ukraine will receive robust security guarantees. Only difference here is that robust has been exchanged for reliable. I'm not sure if anyone besides an international lawyer might be able to appreciate the difference. I don't see what that difference is. It's not like this is a difference between resolved and settled like it was before. So it's unclear, again, if someone just has a different preference for specific words, and that's why we are seeing those words getting exchanged, or maybe that means something that I am not aware of. The other weird thing is that this person, who rewrote this document, now wants to capitalize security guarantees. There's other situations where there is unnecessary capitalization, and that is a thing that kind of annoys me. I hate unnecessary capitalization. Security guarantees is not a proper noun. It's just security guarantees, lowercase letters. Not a big deal to have them lowercase. Point 6. Size of Ukraine military to be capped at 800,000 in peacetime. This is up from 600,000 before. But neither one of those numbers is going to be particularly restrictive. Again, previously with the 600,000, that was relatively large for what you would expect Ukraine to be doing after the war comes to a conclusion. Before the war, Ukraine had something between 200 to 300,000. That's specifically before the full-scale invasion in 2022. And even in the midst of this war, Ukraine has something between 800 and 850,000 soldiers. So in that light, the restriction inside of Europe's document of 800,000 during peacetime is not much of a restriction at all. The other thing that Europe did was add in peacetime as a clause, and that is subtly important. Because it says 800,000 in peacetime, the moment that Ukraine is involved in a war, Ukraine is allowed to break this ceasefire, at least as it was written previously under Russia's terms, and go up to a number of soldiers above 800,000. And you might be thinking to yourself, why does that actually matter? If there is going to be some sort of new conflict involving Ukraine, then Russia is going to be the enemy. The ceasefire will have broken for that purpose, and so all of this doesn't matter at that point. Well, sure, but Ukraine also has another neighbor to the north, Belarus. You can imagine a world in which Belarus invades Ukraine, but it's not actually Belarus. It's Russia prodding Belarus to invade Ukraine. And if you had the previous restriction of 600,000 personnel, well, certainly Ukraine would want to break that if there is a serious invasion from Belarus. Ukraine would want to be able to mobilize way more forces than just 600,000. And so if Ukraine were to do that, Ukraine would be breaking the previous terms, which would then allow Russia to respond. Here, that's not the case. If Belarus invades Ukraine, Ukraine declares war, and suddenly that 800,000 cap no longer is present, because that is not an 800,000 cap in peacetime with Russia. It is 800,000 in any time that there is peace. As soon as peace goes away in any way, shape, or form, then so does that 800,000 cap. Point 7. Ukraine joining NATO depends on consensus of NATO members, which does not exist. And for those of you who are just listening to me and not watching this, in fact, on the screen and in the document, it actually says that consensus of NATO members does not exist. This is very different from the Russian document, which would force Ukraine to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, which was never going to be politically feasible. And also in that Russian document, it said that NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future, which again is not politically feasible because that would require unanimous consent inside of NATO. And you're going to have a whole bunch of veto players, like everyone on the eastern flank, who's going to say, absolutely not, we will not have a statute that says that Ukraine can never join. So Europe's version of Point 7 is just reflecting the reality of the situation. Any conversation about Ukraine joining NATO is a conversation between Ukraine and NATO and no one else. But, by the way, Russia, in case you think Ukraine is about to join NATO, no, don't forget that there is no consensus in NATO about this. And in contrast to everyone on the eastern flank, there's a bunch of skeptical members in NATO that do not want to have Ukraine join anytime soon. And look, it's easy to criticize democratic institutions for being slow and deliberative, and certainly a big theme of yesterday's video and what we're talking about here with agenda-setting power is Europe's failure to actually make moves, in part because of the deliberation process. But there are plenty of cases where being a democracy is helpful, and this is one of them. It is much easier for NATO to be able to make a credible commitment to not having Ukraine join the organization anytime soon when NATO has this deliberative process that requires unanimous consent among all of its members for Ukraine to get in. Point 8. NATO agrees not to permanently station troops under its command in Ukraine in peacetime. I'm going to explicitly say what it says with the Russian case. Point 8 there was NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. There are a bunch of changes that have gone on here, even though the number of words isn't all that dissimilar between these 2 points. Note that the European version of this does not say that NATO permanently agrees not to station troops. It says that NATO agrees not to permanently station troops. Do you catch the distinction between the two? If one day the Supreme Allied Commander Europe decides that now would be a good time to conduct some training exercises in Ukraine, and then sends a bunch of troops there to go do those training exercises, nothing in the ceasefire says that that would be a violation. All this forbids is NATO permanently stationing troops on Ukrainian soil. And that is an important distinction, because for Ukraine to eventually join NATO, Ukraine needs to meet NATO operational standards. And the only way that happens is if Ukraine is training with NATO, which is why I had that specific hypothetical from just a second ago. There are going to be various times in the upcoming years where NATO is going to want to send troops to Ukraine for the purposes of conducting exercises with Ukraine. Long term, Europe is actually making a concession to Russia here. Imagine a future where Ukraine has joined NATO. Then there are programs that NATO runs right now that Ukraine would not be eligible for if NATO is agreeing not to permanently station troops under its command in Ukraine. Think specifically about the Enhanced Forward Presence program along NATO's eastern flank. There you've had NATO send a bunch of soldiers from various countries along the eastern flank, in part to protect them, but also so that in the event that those countries get run over, then the countries that have sent troops along the eastern flank are going to be upset by all of their soldiers having been killed, and then are going to do something to extract revenge on Russia, which then credibly deters Russia from trying to take those sorts of actions in the first place. All of that is off the table here, with the caveat that they added the in peacetime clause. And that does matter because, again, going back to a hypothetical Belarusian invasion of Ukraine, if that happens after Ukraine is a member of NATO, then NATO could invoke Article 5, have a bunch of countries come to protect Ukraine, which would mean having troops permanently stationed there. The other noteworthy clause is that this is referring to troops under its command, which means you can't have the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe going in and saying that we need to have a bunch of troops inside of Ukraine. But you could still, according to this, have a coalition of the willing, in which you have NATO countries, independently and outside of the NATO authority, going into Ukraine to prop up Ukraine and hold the ceasefire in place. And that's important for the same sort of tripwire logic that we talked about a minute ago. Even if you don't have NATO sending the troops along the front lines, if you have the coalition of the willing doing this, then it's all the same if they get run over in the event of some sort of Russian attack. That is going to infuriate the troops' respective capitals, which is then going to perhaps result in a large response, and again, deterring Russia from doing that in the first place. Point 9. NATO fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. This is still just as weird as it was before, and maybe even weirder. Previously, it just said that European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. They're already there. There are already fighter jets from NATO countries inside of Poland. That's not going to change as a consequence of a ceasefire, so it's weird that they're talking about this. And it's even stranger now that they're being referred to as NATO fighter jets, because NATO does not own fighter jets. The respective NATO countries do. So maybe they're trying to hedge into this some sort of way of saying that it's okay if you have a NATO program, like the Enhanced Forward Presence program, going on in Poland. It's okay to have NATO fighter jets there, but the NATO fighter jets are not NATO fighter jets because they're not owned by NATO. So it's a little bit weird on the phrasing, but whatever. This one is not particularly consequential. Thus begins the reading again. Point 10. U.S. guarantee that mirrors Article 5. A. U.S. to receive compensation for the guarantee. B. If Ukraine invades Russia, it forfeits the guarantee. C. If Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to a robust coordinated military response, all global sanctions will be restored, and any kind of recognition for the new territory and all other benefits from this agreement will be withdrawn. A few points here. One, it's odd to describe this as a guarantee that mirrors Article 5. This is only committing the United States to this. I don't understand why Europe did not add itself to this list, and why this is just restricted to the United States that is supposed to be offering this Article 5 style guarantee. But when you have it as just being bilateral, if this is just between the United States and Ukraine, the whole point of Article 5 is that an attack on one is an attack on all. And if you're doing this bilaterally, then what you're actually saying is that an attack on one is an attack on the other one, which does not sound nearly as punchy. Maybe what they were going for here is a concise document. We all know what Article 5 means, so rather than writing paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, you just shorthand it as Article 5. Well, whatever. The big problem here, as we've talked about in the video on the Russian version of this deal, and as we talked about even further back for weeks, for months, for years, is this only works if the guarantee is actually credible, that the US would want to act when push comes to shove. A weird thing that is consistent across the two versions of the document is that the first subpoint says that the United States will receive compensation for the guarantee, without saying who is going to actually pay for that compensation. Is it coming from Ukraine? Is Europe going to throw in some money? Is Europe going to take the frozen Russian assets and pay the United States out of that? I don't know. What I do know is that the absence of the fourth subpoint is fascinating. Previously, in the Russian document, it said that if Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, the security guarantee will be deemed invalid. Europe has deleted that. Why? On the surface, it seems that from the European perspective, that fourth subpoint should not be controversial. Europe does not want to be in a position where it is incentivizing in a perverse way Ukraine to attack Moscow or St. Petersburg with long-range drones. Because if Ukraine does that, Ukraine is still protected by the security guarantee that the United States, or maybe Europe elsewhere in this document or implicitly in a separate agreement, is offering. If I had to speculate what's going on here, it's that Europe is very worried about a false flag attack. That in the future, Russia is going to stage an attack on Moscow or St. Petersburg and say that Ukraine did that, and then as a consequence, use that as the justification to restart the war with Ukraine. If the fourth subpoint is in the ceasefire deal, you can imagine what will happen next. Russia will say, hey, you have in this deal an agreement with Ukraine that if we attack Ukraine, then you are going to respond by punishing us. However, if Ukraine attacks us and we attack back, you are not going to do anything. The ceasefire is broken, and you, Western countries, are under no obligation to come to Ukraine's aid because Ukraine is the one that broke it. But we were the ones attacked, so when we attack back, we are not breaking the ceasefire agreement. You guys are going to hold steady. That's the type of debate that's going to happen, because Europe is going to respond by saying, no, that's not what happened. In fact, there was a false flag attack. Russia attacked Russia. Ukraine did not attack Russia. And so if Russia, you strike Ukraine, we are going to come to Ukraine's aid. However, if you strike that fourth subpoint, none of this matters. There is no debate to be had. If Russia says that Ukraine attacked Russia, and Europe is saying that it was a false flag attack, when Russia complains that Europe is threatening to intervene on behalf of Ukraine if Russia tries to invade Ukraine, the response from Europe is that it does not matter. There is no provision in the ceasefire that says if Ukraine strikes you with a missile in Moscow or St. Petersburg, that the ceasefire is broken. So it does not matter whether it was a Ukrainian attack, as you claim it was. It does not matter whether it was a false flag attack, as we claim it was. Either way, if you invade Ukraine right now, we are going to come to Ukraine's defense. And then hopefully that deters Russia from invading Ukraine, and maybe it deters the false flag attack in the first place. Point 11. Ukraine is eligible for EU membership and will get short-term preferred market access to Europe while this is being evaluated. Other than my point from a few days ago, that there are a bunch of European farmers that are not going to be happy about Ukrainian EU membership, and the sorts of issues that are going to come along with that. There isn't much of a change between Europe's version of the document and Russia's, so we should just move on. Point 12. Robust global redevelopment package for Ukraine, including but not limited to A. Creation of Ukraine Development Fund to invest in high-growth industries, including technology, data centers, and AI efforts. B. The United States will partner with Ukraine to jointly restore, grow, modernize, and operate Ukraine's gas infrastructure, which includes its pipeline and storage facilities. C. A joint effort to redevelop areas impacted by the war to restore, redevelop, and modernize cities and residential areas. D. Infrastructure development. E. Mineral and natural resource extraction. F. A special financing package will be developed by the World Bank to provide financing to accelerate these efforts. Again, not much of a change between the Europe and the Russian document, so let's move on. Point 13. Russia to be progressively reintegrated into the global economy. A. Sanction relief will be discussed and agreed upon in phases and on a case-by-case basis. B. The United States will enter into a long-term economic cooperation agreement to pursue mutual development in the areas of energy, natural resources, infrastructure, AI, data centers, rare earths, joint projects in the Arctic, as well as various other mutually beneficial corporate opportunities. C. Russia to be invited back into the G8. A few points to be noted here. One is that Russia is now progressively reintegrated into the global economy, rather than in the previous document where Russia had it written as Russia will be integrated into the global economy. Even though if you keep reading further down into the subpoints of the previous document, the lifting of the sanctions was still going to be discussed and agreed upon in stages and on a case-by-case basis. So it wasn't going to happen overnight either way in either of these setups. I suspect that Europe kept subpoint B about the United States' economic cooperation agreement because they are betting that that's the type of thing that's very important to the Trump administration. So if they want the Trump administration to not immediately discard this new document, they have to include some of that stuff. It is more interesting that Europe kept subpoint C about Russia being invited back into the G8, even though, as I said in the video on the Russian document, that the reason that Russia was kicked out of the G8 back, 11 years ago, was because of the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea, which is what spawned this general conflict between Ukraine and Russia. That is the issue. That is not going to be fully settled in the way that you would imagine after this conflict has ended, because Russia will still maintain possession of not only that territory, but further territory. So the underlying conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the broader Western coalition is not going to go away. So it's interesting that Russia is nevertheless going to be invited back to the G8, and one wonders whether there will be a lot of extra provisions thrown in there. Sure, the G7 might invite Russia back to the G8, but it will come with all sorts of provisions to make sure that Russia is a player in the global economy in the same manner that the other G7 countries are. And maybe Japan, which is not involved in this provision, but is involved in the G7, will have some thoughts about what Russia has to be doing as well. So yes, within the ceasefire, there's going to be an invitation, but an invitation does not mean that Russia is immediately going to be back into the G7, and we're going to have to change all of the signs back to G8. Point 14. Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine. That is massively stripping down what previously appeared. You can see that there would have been me talking for almost a minute about the Russian version of this, which has all sorts of provisions about the United States having some sort of economic relationship with Russia and with receiving some sort of the profits associated with any sort of reconstruction going on inside of Ukraine. Referencing point 13 and how Europe maintains some of those provisions that throw economic bones to the United States, Europe does not have unlimited patience with this, and that's why you're seeing a bunch of that sort of conversation cut out from Europe's version of point 14. I think this raises a broader question about what to do with those frozen Russian assets. One of the main reasons for holding on to those assets is that you can effectively hold them hostage and say that if Russia does not meet certain provisions of a particular deal, that Russia will not get that money back, and Europe will keep holding on to it. And that is a good reason to hold on to that money. That is how crisis bargaining works. If you think about the costs associated with fighting a war from Russia's perspective, a cost is the opportunity cost of fighting. It's what you get by fighting versus what you get by not fighting. So if you don't fight, you get paid the money. If you do fight, you don't get paid the money. Implicitly, then, fighting comes with an extra cost, and that can be extracted out of Russia at the bargaining table. However, the longer that the conversation continues about the United States somehow being able to access those funds, the more that Europe is going to need to think to itself, maybe we need to start spending this now. Because if the money is no longer there, then the United States can't be asking for it. And if the United States is going to be asking for it, that does not actually provide us leverage to bargain against Russia. And instead, what we should be doing with that money is turning that money into weapons and have those weapons be sent to Ukraine, and then have Ukraine use those weapons as leverage to then force Russia to the bargaining table under more favorable circumstances. Point 15. A joint security, with a capital S, task force will be established with the participation of US, Ukraine, Russia, and the Europeans to promote and enforce all of the provisions of this agreement. Not much has changed in the Europe document versus the Russia document, except that Europe has added Europe and Ukraine to the mix, which makes sense given that they are all key actors in this conflict. Point 16. Russia will legislatively enshrine a non-aggression policy toward Europe and Ukraine. The only difference with the Europe document versus the Russia document, as I emphasized, was the word legislatively. And really, that's not going to make much of a difference. The key problem with this provision is that Russia is an autocracy, and when you're living in an autocracy, what the leader wants is what the leader gets. I think Europe added this because they do want to see a bill go through the Duma, which may, at the fringes, for the next Russian leader who might not be as powerful as Vladimir Putin, prevent the next executive from being able to cancel anything like this. So there is a world in which that it matters, but that's down the line. It's not going to be anytime soon. Point 17. The United States and Russia agree to extend nuclear non-proliferation and control treaties, including Fair Start. I'm still baffled why we can't get the nuclear stuff correct. In the video I did about the Russian version of this document, one of the big pieces of evidence that it was a real amateur hour there is that it said that they want to extend the START 1 treaty, a treaty that expired about 16 years ago. Now in the European version of this document, they're extending the Fair Start. I don't know what that is, and I've done some searching to make sure that I wasn't missing something, and I could not find anything. The only thing that I could find in the context of a Fair Start treaty is actually the discussion around the European document itself from now just, the last 24 hours or so. I once again think that they intend to say the New START treaty, which is set to expire in only a few months in February. But I don't understand why we have gotten it wrong twice now. It's not the START 1, it's not Fair Start, I don't know what that is, it's the New START treaty. I'm also a little bit confused about how the European document consistently has unnecessary capitalization, but then with START, which stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is supposed to be all capitals. It just has the first capital S and everything else is in lowercase. Who knows? Point 18. Ukraine agrees to remain a non-nuclear state under the NPT. So the only change going from the Russian document to the European document is that Russia said that Ukraine is going to agree to be in accordance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whereas Europe is removing any ambiguity here. Ukraine is already in compliance with the NPT and will continue to be in compliance with the NPT. Point 19. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will be restarted under the supervision of the IAEA, and the produced power shall be shared equitably in a 50-50 split between Russia and Ukraine. No real changes in the two documents here, but actually, if we look at the other European document that has faded out of public attention, there is something interesting to be seen there. Its point 19 says that Ukraine regains control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Well, as much as Ukraine might like that, the fact of the matter is that Zaporizhzhia's nuclear power plant is on the opposite side of the Dnipro River. So if Ukraine were to somehow regain control of that power plant and nothing else, effectively all of the people working at that power plant would be hostages. In the event of any conflict with Russia, all of them would be completely vulnerable and would be immediately arrested or worse. I don't want to speak to the quality of the rest of the second document, but you can understand why at least this particular point was moved away from. Even if you think that Ukraine does deserve some level of compensation for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the way to get it is not by actually retaking part or all of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The way that you're getting it with the other agreements, both the Russian one and the European one, is that Ukraine is getting some of the electricity coming out of it. But to actually move Ukrainian soldiers and personnel into that area, for one thing, Russia is not going to accept Ukrainian soldiers being over there, which means you just have the personnel, which means you're creating a weakness, a vulnerability, not a positive for yourself. Use the fact that you think that you deserve some sort of concession regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to get something elsewhere, rather than creating another problem for yourself later on. Point 20. Ukraine will adopt EU rules on religious tolerance and the protection of linguistic minorities. As you can see, this has been massively stripped down to what Russia submitted, and in fact represents no real concession at all from Ukraine, because if Ukraine wants to join the EU, it is going to have to adopt EU rules anyway. Looking at the Russian side of the document, the thing in particular that it strips out is this idea that all Nazi ideology and activities must be rejected and prohibited. Once more, it's not because Europe loves Nazis, and it's not because Russia doesn't have any issues with Nazis. Neither of those things is true. It's that Russia, again, wants to project as though the Ukrainian government is a Nazi regime, a neo-Nazi regime, and that what Russia is doing right now with its special military operation is simply a continuation of what was fought and won during the Great Patriotic War, or what the West calls World War II. Point 21. Territories. Ukraine commits not to recover its occupied sovereign territory through military means. Negotiations on territorial swaps will start from the line of contact. Well, the upshot of the new version of this, one, is that I have less reading to do, because there were 4 subpoints going on previously with the Russian version of the document. But focusing exclusively on the concerns that Ukraine has, there's no giving up or mortgaging the area of the Donbass that Russia has not yet conquered, which would mean that Ukraine gives up its best defensive fortifications that would prevent Russia from trying to advance again. So that part of the problem with the previous document is gone. That's a good sign. It also removes the de facto recognized oxymoron that appeared previously in the first subpoint for the Russian version of the agreement, that Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States. You can't recognize something as de facto. That is not what that means. The problem here is that this is going to be a non-starter from the Russian side, because there is no firm sort of language on what's supposed to be happening with the territory. It is, let's call a timeout on the war, and we'll figure it out later. And the Russian concern is that if you call a timeout, then Ukraine is going to be able to invest further into those defensive fortifications. And so if the war were to restart without Russia seeing some sort of benefit associated with the pause, Russia is going to be less inclined or less able to fight and take more territory, which is again what Russia wants. And if you want Russia to stop fighting the war, you have to do something to convince Russia that continuing to fight is worse than accepting the deal. And here we just don't have anything on the paper, so it's going to be very, very unlikely that Moscow is going to look at this and think to itself, yeah, it's okay, we can go on with this peace deal and see what happens. The problem with the Russian version of the document was not the de facto territory that Russia was going to receive, or at least not the vast majority of it. That territory, what Russia has already conquered, is going to be very difficult to unstick Russia from. Certainly not at the current level of military spending, and it's unclear whether there is enough political will in the West to be able to raise it to the level of not only getting Ukraine to stop Russia from advancing, but reverse those advances. So, long story short, Europe and Ukraine are going to have to sort this out a little bit more and try to figure out what is the bare minimum that de facto Russia is going to have possession of after this war ends to be able to get Russia to stop. And if Russia is still asking for too much, then figuring out the way of maximizing Ukraine's military power to punish Russia for continuing the war. Point 22. Once future territorial arrangements have been agreed, both the Russian Federation and Ukraine undertake not to change any of these agreements by force. Any security guarantees will not apply if there is a breach of this obligation. I don't think it's worth delving into what's going on here because it hasn't really changed from the Russian version of this document. But once again, it is worth noting that it is one thing for Russia to say that it is not going to change any of these agreements by force, but actually getting that to happen in practice is difficult, and certainly the West has struggled with that for the last decade or so. Point 23. Russia shall not obstruct Ukraine's use of the Dnieper River for purposes of commercial activities, and agreements will be reached for grain shipments to move freely through the Black Sea. Nothing to report on here as changes between Russia and Europe's deal, although it is still interesting and odd that Europe is using the Russian transliteration of the Dnieper River instead of the Ukrainian transliteration. Point 24. A humanitarian committee will be established to resolve open issues. A. All remaining prisoners and bodies will be exchanged on the principle of all for all. B. All civilian detainees and hostages will be returned, including children. C. There will be a family reunification program. D. Provisions will be made to address the suffering of victims from the conflict. Again, not much changing here, so no need to go further into depth on it. Point 25. Ukraine will hold elections as soon as possible after signing of the peace agreement. This differs from the Russian version of the document, which said that Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. And there are a couple of subtle differences here worth going through. 1. There is no 100-day limitation. When that 100-day number came out a few days ago, some viewed it as being too short to sort out what's going to happen with the actual vote. Because it is going to be complicated in practice. You have to have a vote very quickly after a war has ended. And the reason why the Ukrainian constitution removes, in part, having elections during war is because actually having people cast ballots is difficult. And while it's going to be a little bit easier after a war ends, because people aren't going to be worried about being shot or bombed in the process of voting, you still have to actually sort out the logistics of the vote. That requires answering questions like, who can vote? Where can they vote? How can those individuals get to those voting places? And while that seems relatively easy and straightforward enough when you have a long-standing democracy that is around in a peacetime situation, it's very different when you have the end of a war happening, you have a demilitarized zone forming, and maybe some of the individuals living in the demilitarized zone have to vote in that election. How are they going to do that? Along those lines, it is strange that there is no regulation on movement discussed anywhere in these documents, whether we're talking about the European one or the Russian one. And if you have individuals that are going to be living in demilitarized zones, or who were previously and maybe still are Ukrainian citizens that are now inside of de facto Russian-controlled areas, what happens with them? Are they allowed to cross over? Is there going to be an opportunity for that sort of thing to happen? That's the type of thing that has to get sorted out before an election happens, because if you have an election, you actually have to have people voting. And if you have question marks about who's allowed to vote in those areas and how they're actually going to physically vote, then you can't run an election. And maybe 100 days is too short of a time period to be able to do that. Another difference between the two documents is that the clock starts in the European version of this after the peace agreement is signed. And if we're thinking about this not as an actual peace agreement, but rather as a ceasefire agreement, which is going to build up to an actual peace agreement, there is going to be a long time period that passes between the two of those. It would not surprise me to find out that it is months. If you told me in 2026 that it had not yet happened in 2026, I would not be especially surprised. It could take more than a year. And so there is a potential big difference in the number of days between when those elections would happen if you look at the Russian version of this versus the European version of this. Now, it makes sense that Europe would want to wait until the peace agreement is officially signed, because this is an important thing from Russia's perspective. Russia has been talking all along about how the Ukrainian regime is illegitimate, and so if you have an election, you're essentially giving a concession to Russia and perhaps not getting anything in return. On the other hand, Russia should be aware of the fact that if Ukraine has an election and Zelensky either chooses not to run or loses, the most likely next president of Ukraine is Valery Zelensky, and it's hard to see how Valery Zelensky is not going to be very tough on Russia, and perhaps maybe in some ways tougher than Zelensky has been. Point 26. Provisions will be made to address the suffering of victims of the conflict. Note what is missing here. It has stripped out everything about forgiving war crimes. The previous version of this was never going to work anyway. The International Criminal Court was not going to suddenly dismiss war crimes charges because Ukraine and Russia had signed a deal that said that the war crimes were going to be forgiven. That was a deal that was signed under duress. The International Criminal Court does not really care very much about that anyway. If you think that war crimes have international jurisdiction, there is universal jurisdiction on war crimes, then it doesn't matter if there is a bilateral treaty signed between Ukraine and Russia on this point. It doesn't matter if you have other countries signing on as well. The International Criminal Court is not going to look at that and change its mind, and so anyone that is signed domestic legislation committing themselves to upholding the rules that the ICC has created, they're all still going to be on the hook for this. And as a broader point here, if the statute of limitations for war crimes is the duration of the war itself, that perversely incentivizes war to continue for a longer period of time, and it doesn't disincentivize the war crime from being committed in the first place. Point 27. This agreement will be legally binding. Its implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by a board of peace, chaired by President Donald J. Trump. There will be no penalties for violation. Well, it seems like Europe is sticking with that Trump genuflection, but other than that, not much to report on this point. Point 28. Upon all sides agreeing to this memorandum, a ceasefire will be immediately effective upon both parties withdrawing to the agreed-upon points for the implementation of the agreement to begin. Ceasefire modalities, including monitoring, will be agreed by both parties under U.S. supervision. It's just that last sentence that has been added to the European version of the document that, I guess it's another genuflection to the United States, right? Ceasefire modalities, including monitoring, will be agreed by both parties under the supervision of the United States. I suppose this gives me one final opportunity to point out that if you want all of this to work out, if you want the United States to do the things in the document that the United States is supposed to be doing, you actually have to incentivize the United States to follow through on it. And that is still missing from this document. Maybe there's going to be some sort of separate discussion and separate agreements that make this enforceable, but the document by itself is not enforceable. It is not self-enforcing, at least the way it stands currently. So, is this document an improvement over the previous one? Yes, from a European perspective on what Europe wants, and yes, on just a basic perspective on how these documents should be constructed with fewer glaring errors. Does it mean that Europe has resolved this problem? No. There are still going to be issues with getting Russia to sign this, of course. There's also just the general problem of the fact that Europe, by slowing things down, has ceded the agenda control to Russia. And so all of the problems of Europe following on this and having to write the entire document based around what Russia wanted the document to be based around is still problematic. But, of course, it's an improvement as compared to what Russia is getting by writing the document itself. And so this seems like a great time to say thank you again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. You can either go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take an excellent 40% off Advantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Hopefully a while from now. I'm getting kind of tired. Take care.